Take heed, therefore, unto yourselves, and to all the flock, over the which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood. For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away disciples after them. Therefore watch.
And welcome back, dear brothers and sisters, to God is Walking on Water channel. And tonight is going to be an exciting discussion, an intriguing discussion between myself and our guest, Andrew Griffin. I have seen you, Andrew, on the Gospel Truth channel, as well as Standing for Truth channel. I know you've got an upcoming debate you mentioned in our private discussion. So I have seen your debates, and it's interesting because you actually, when you were speaking to me on Messenger, it's interesting that we both realized that on these platforms, you don't get much of Unitarians versus Unitarians. So I do not brand myself as a Unitarian. I brand myself as a Monarchian. And tonight, the topic will be on monarchianism. And I would be glad to answer some of your questions. And I will be asking you some questions as well in regards to this topic. And I'm sure it will be a edifying discussion for the audience. So before we start, Andrew, could you just give just a short just introduction? Thank you.
Hi, Caleb. Thanks for having me. I love your channel. I love the opening. That really got me into like a whole different frame of mind. That's a great frame of mind to be in. Thank you for having me. I look forward to this discussion. I love that the discussion is coming to a place where let's not talk about later 3rd and 4th century doctrines. Let's bring it back to the foundation of where everything began. Let's just start there. But basically, as Caleb said, my name's Andrew Griffin. I have a small YouTube channel called Unitarian Apologetics. I've done several debates online, mainly against Trinitarians. I am a more of a biblical Unitarian. So I don't believe in pre-existence. I don't believe that Jesus is God himself. Although my view might differ quite a bit from your typical Unitarians, is basically the same. I grew up in a oneness Pentecostal background, so that is my background. The Pentecostal church, always has a special place in my heart, and definitely more, obviously more close to the original teachings. And I do believe if Jesus was God, he would have to be the Father incarnate. And so, yeah, I do have an upcoming debate next Saturday, not this Saturday, but the following Saturday with Jewish Rabbi Eduardo Arroyo. And we'll be debating whether the Logos is a person or not. And he comes from more of a Jewish side and probably going to argue from the Memra and things like this. So, yeah, it's an honor to be here with you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Well, thank you for that short summary of where exactly you situate yourself and your background. And I'm actually surprised because I was not aware that you came from a oneness background. So I think the discussion will be even more interesting. I have to say this, Andrew, I do not brand myself as a modalist, either as a oneness, and I'll explain the reasons why. I come from a background where I do see that there is only one divine spirit that is called God. There is not a notion in my view that Jesus possesses two separate spirits within that same body. You've probably heard about Nestorianism. that, he was leaning towards this idea that there are two persons in Christ. So I do not subscribe to that. I do believe that the Father was operating in the Son. We do see scriptures, congruent scriptures, showing that it was the Father who worked through the Son. It was the Father doing the miracles through the Son. And when I say Son, I do not mean it in the literal sense. I mean it in the nominal sense. So Noetus of Smyrna, I'm sure you're well familiar with Noetus of Smyrna. The earliest teachers of the monarchian view were people like Noetus of Smyrna, Praxius. Some scholars believe that Praxius was a nickname for either Noetus or Callistus, but I think Callistus is a very poor assessment. I do believe that Praxius was Noetus. And it's interesting because we do see Noetus coming from the city of Smyrna. The reason why I find it interesting is because there are only two churches that are mentioned in the book of Revelation, the 7 churches in Asia Minor, that are perfect. So they are not corrected by Jesus. You have the Church of Philadelphia and the Church of Smyrna, and you can check this for yourself. So I think that the fact that Noetus came from Smyrna already, it shows a good track record in regards to the faith, if we're going to make that case. And he came to Rome. He was well received by the Bishop Victor. And Victor is very interesting because you as a Unitarian, I don't know if you would be comfortable with the term adoptionist or Theodotian. Are you familiar with those terms?
I am. I know that they believe that Jesus did not become divine until his baptism.
Right.
I don't know that I subscribe to that too much. I tend to believe that he became divine more through his intellectual development and
right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's interesting because during that time, let's give a rough approximative date. It's about 180 AD. So we're talking about late 2nd century. Now, some theologians, scholars like Reinhard Hübner, you might write that down. Reinhard Hübner is a Roman Catholic theologian that came with this controversial book, Der Paradox Antignostischer im zweiten Jahrhundert. Now, in that book, he basically makes the case that Ignatius of Antioch, you're familiar with Ignatius of Antioch, was actually relying on Noetus, and Noetus preceded Ignatius of Antioch. David Litwa, if you're familiar with David Litwa, is a professor, I believe he's a professor. He actually makes the case that Noetus probably, and there is a strong possibility that he was a bishop of Smyrna. That would be the case why he was well received by the bishops in Rome. It's a very strong case. And it's interesting because the Monarchians, modern day theologians will distinguish dynamistic monarchianism and modalistic monarchianism. Now, according to the ancient term itself, there are many unbiased theologians that will say it's a wrong appellation, that the term monarchian was strictly belonged to those who profess that Jesus was the Father himself, that the Father was incarnate. And you have this in the Encyclopedia, volume 10 of John Chapman, an Anglican theologian. He makes that very, very clear that the term monarchian was used by Tertullian in his treatise against Praxius. He calls them monarchiani. So the whole attack is directed to that group of persons who profess that it was the Father who was incarnate. They only knew of one God. And you and I, we both agree to this, that there is only one God, the Father, not God, the Son. I don't believe in God, the Holy Spirit. So we do see eye to eye in that regard. So this is just a brief summary of what I see to be true from my position.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So I do have some questions. That's why I'm kind of coming to you instead of trying to look for it in all these
Sure.
individual places. You seem passionate about it. Seems like something you're very, very knowledgeable in. So I'm not here to debate you. More just here to get information and kind of feel you out as something I'm not really too familiar with. Like you said, most of the time when I've heard monarchianism, it's from dynamic monarchianism or adoptionism. I wasn't even aware that monarchianism was also what people traditionally call modalism.
Right.
So I do have some questions. My first question is about Noetus of Smyrna.
Sure.
How do we know what he teaches? Does he have any firsthand accounts, like primary sources that he wrote, or is it like a lot of doctrines which were later called heresies? Is it just we only know about it from other people's writings?
Very good question. Very good question, Andrew. Actually, I appreciate that question. We only get a depiction of his theology from his adversaries, from his opponents. And it's very interesting because Hippolytus would be the main source in his work, the Philosophumena, in, I believe it's book 9, where he divulges the history of Noetus and the bishops in Rome, and how his heresy started, to even attract later bishops like Callistus. So from that standpoint, we only get a depiction of his theology from his opponents, which is very interesting, Andrew, because the book 9 was not in the original book itself, the Philosophumena. It was found on Mount Athos in Greece in the 1800s, late 1800s. I think it was in 1856, and you can double check me on this, but I have researched this. I believe one of the sources that has done much research on this, it was a professor, but I forget his name, but I checked this recently. And yes, they did find the manuscripts of these attacks on Noetus and the bishops in Rome that held to this view, monarchianism, which was they actually used this slander word, Patripassianism, that the father suffered. So I find it interesting that these writings they only found these writings at a later date, after the Council of Nicaea, and this was actually medieval. During the 14th century, it was dated back to the 14th century. These manuscripts, these Greek manuscripts that were found on Mount Athos in Greece.
And what do you think the significance of that is?
Well, knowing how the Trinitarians have added passages that they've actually tampered a lot with the Bible, and I will say this boldly, I'm not ashamed to say this. I have done my homework in this regard. For instance, you're familiar with the Comma Joannum, 1 John 5:7. It is an uncontested fact that this was a spurious text, that this was added. Literally, if you read the 1 John 5, the whole chapter is talking about Jesus. So the main object is Jesus, and it completely derails to these three characters. And that it was actually a gloss by Erasmus. Apparently was Erasmus responsible for this gloss. But yes, even the church fathers, they don't allude to it verbatim. They don't allude to it in an explicit form. There are allusions to a Trinity, the doctrine, but it's not explicit. So it just shows me that these theologians that converted to Christianity were originally philosophers like Justin Martyr. And this is fact. They were literally philosophers before the conversion, and
Yep.
they started, to add the sort of leaven to the Hebraic faith and how the Hebrews viewed God.
So the book 9 is the one which actually speaks against monarchianism. Is that what you're saying? And that
Yes.
wasn't found until the 1800s.
Right. And you also have other witnesses like I've just mentioned Tertullian, which that in itself is a pretty solid in regards to Tertullian actually trying to refute the monarchians in his time. So that would be during the 200s. Even before Tertullian in the 180, he was already present as a writer. So I do see Adversus against Praxeas and Novatian. Novatian as well wrote against the monarchians, and I'll give you the reference. In Novatian chapter 76, even prior to that, he actually talks about the monarchians in great detail. So those are some of the witnesses to the monarchian controversy. Oh, sorry, not 76. My bad. Chapter 28. That was Justin Martyr. So it's chapter 28 on his treatise on the Trinity, the Trinitate.
So how widespread would you say that monarchianism was in the, or would you go as far to say that is the original doctrine stemming back from the New Testament times, that monarchianism, would you say that's just one of many different schools of Christianity, or would you say that was the main one, and then only later people, like you said, like Justin Martyr and all the philosophers came in and sort of deviated and added that leaven?
Right. I do see them as having precedence over the Trinitarians, because even the most honest Trinitarian theologians, they will tell you that the doctrine of the Trinity, and I've read many books like you, Andrew. They will tell you that the doctrine, the formula of the Trinity was not explicit. It only came at the Council of Nicaea, where we had a proper, a formulated doctrine. But prior to that, they were speculating. It was really about writing about these ideas between these theologians. But what I find suspicious, Andrew, is that the majority, when they heard of the Logos doctrine, they shunned the doctrine. And you have this in, against Praxeas. Tertullian literally says that when the majority were presented, the monarchians, he calls them monarchiani, when they were presented with this doctrine, they would immediately say, you're preaching 2 or 3 gods. We hold to the monarchy. We hold to the monarchia, which is basically the Shema. It's the Shema. It's just they were speaking as Gentiles in the Greek and the Latin tongue, but clearly they were taught by Paul. They were taught by men that came from the Hebrew faith. And we know this because in Acts 28, Paul taught in Rome. And it literally says in the final verse, no man hindered him. No man in Rome hindered him, meaning the state of Rome allowed Paul to preach freely. And we know even the Jews in his own native state in Judea, they actually forbade him to teach that Jesus Christ is Lord, the Lord. And we do see a high Christology in the writings of the Apostle Paul. So I do believe that the Monarchians were the original Christians, but I will say that the Theodotians, the Ebionites, the Adoptionists, they were actually a teaching at the very same time as the Monarchians. So I am going to be honest about this. I do see them at the same time with the Monarchians, that they were living exactly at the same time. But in regards to the Trinitarians, the Logos party, that came later. And I do see that.
Awesome. All right. So you said that was it Noetus that was well received by Victor?
Yes.
And so is it the same Victor that excommunicated Theodotus? Or
Right, right. The
okay,
leather worker, right, exactly. Eusebius mentions it in his church history.
that's interesting. Um, so you said that you're not a modalist. You don't call yourself a modalist.
The reason why I don't use the term modalism is because it was coined by Adolf Harnack, a Lutheran theologian, a German Lutheran theologian. He literally coined the word just to kind of, pigeonhole us in this category. But I will refer to myself as a monarchian. And I'm not going to, shun people that brand themselves modalist. That's not my point. But I just want to be fair in regards to the ancient term that I do believe there is a conspiracy to kind of, coin this word was coined in order to hide the fact that the monarchians were the majority. It was a popular view. Even Bart Ehrman is honest enough to say, yes, it was a very popular view before the Trinity doctrine was official and formulated properly.
So we essentially have two different schools that were essentially, well, a form of monarchianism, but you don't really agree with that. You think the more technical monarchianism is more like the Father incarnate rather than an adoptionistic?
Right. The reason being because the term monarchiani was used by the adversaries of the Monarchians. So they said, you're preaching the monarchy of God, that God is king, when in the view of the Logos party, they were literally saying that the Son is just as much as God and king as the Father. Like they're all one king, but separate persons. But our view was stressing that it's only one person, one individual. And even Tertullian himself, he says that the term itself, monarchy, implies one person who is king, right? Who has the crown, not a sort of a conglomeration of different persons that are operating all as one king. So I do believe that is correct in that regard. In regards to the Theodotians and the Adoptionists, they actually believe that God gave the authority to Jesus, to the Son, that he could be king. But from my position, it fails because if you read 1 Samuel chapter 8 and 1 Samuel chapter 12, we know that the original king was God himself. And the reason why God allowed Israel to have a king is because Israel demanded for a human king. That is something that I believe is not stressed enough in these debates. The original king of humanity, of the Israelites, was God himself. And we do see in the book of Zechariah, right? Zechariah 14 verse 9, it literally says, on that day there will be one Lord, one king, and his name one. So we only see one person that will be ruling over the better part of humanity, and that we will be giving an account to this individual as well as the sinners. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So here's where things get kind of interesting, because I understand what you're saying about the term modalist, and I completely get that, because as a biblical Unitarian, people say, "Oh, you're a what's that guy's name? Socinian. You're a
Right.
Socinian. You only belong to, you guys only came about in the 1600." And it's like, well, you're kind of missing it, because there's some things I agree with him, but a lot of things I don't agree with him. But you're just kind of using that to dismiss us. So I completely get that.
I agree.
And I won't hold you to that. Sometimes these terms are good if we're just trying to explain the nature, express how we understand the nature of God. So I do have questions for clarification. Again, I'm not trying to debate. I'm just trying to understand how
Sure.
you answer this, understand how your thinking works, because who knows, we might agree in the end. I don't really know yet.
Sure.
So typically people will say that modalists will say that there's one God who sort of manifests himself in different modes. You don't agree with that? I mean, not the term modalist and everything
Sure,
that
sure.
goes with that, but yeah.
Sure. So do I believe that God can manifest himself in different forms? Well, yes, I do. And this is interesting because I would like to hear your thoughts on Genesis 18. Would like to hear your thoughts on the one who wrestled with Jacob, because I do believe I know what from which angle you're going to be treating this. And I do think it would be interesting, Andrew, if we do, we can consult the patristics like Justin Martyr and Novation, because they actually call God the angel of great counsel. The reason why I'm saying this is because they use the Septuagint, and I am anti-Septuagint. And I'll explain the reasons why I'm anti-Septuagint, because the Septuagint was composed in Alexandria. And I don't know if you knew this, but the Trinitarian, the Logos Alexandrians, they are the only party in what is called orthodoxy that stressed that there was an eternal generation of the Son. So they believed in the eternal generation of the Son before the incarnation. And I do see a leaven of Arianism in the Septuagint, where they are using these passages like Isaiah 9:6, where they're actually omitting the mighty God. That is removed literally from the Septuagint. And the everlasting Father, Abi-ad in Hebrew, is removed as well. And I've done my homework. I'm not saying this, that I'm better than anyone in this regard, but I have done my homework, and I have seen the great Isaiah scroll, not physically in the city of Jerusalem, but I've seen it in pictures, and they do have that highlighted passage in the great Isaiah scroll where you have the mighty God and the everlasting Father in reference to what I believe is the Son. And I think it's interesting that the Septuagint would remove those passages, at least the theologians behind its composition.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I think we'll work our way there. I got some interesting notes, and hopefully we can bring it all together so we can understand each other. So are you familiar with Benjamin Sommer's work, The Bodies of God?
Yes,
is that sort of something? So you have like one self, and he can, because you said he can manifest himself, and I don't disagree with that. And so we're in common terms there, and that's great. God is just one person. So the real question is, well, how does he manifest himself?
Right.
And so.
And actually, Benjamin Sommers, I've actually seen some of his podcasts. He literally said that the ancient rabbis, so that is the Hebrews, they had no issue. It was not a taboo to think of God as appearing in multiple ways. That is, he could appear in different bodies. And I think that's interesting that he would say that. And he says that the idea that God the Father could never appear only occurred with Maimonides, and it was due to Greek influence in Rabbinic Judaism, where they started to limit God the Father and say, no, he can't appear. He's there in that panic room, in that echo chamber, and we can't really see him. So I know the Calvinists, they believe that as well. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. So because I my kind of area that I spend a lot of time in is studying like Philo of Alexandria. But also, I mean, so it's a lot to unpack, because the Hebraic tradition of sort of paraphrasing and adding to the Bible is something that also, as you know, exists in the Targums.
Right.
And so they would change things up. And but I want to get to that because it ties into Genesis 18. Genesis 18, remind me, is that the Yahweh said to Yahweh, or is that the Abraham having lunch with the angel of the Lord?
That's where it says the Lord appeared in the plains of Mamre, and then we find 3 characters appearing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's before we do that, so we agree that God is one person. We agree that it's not like you said, not taboo to say that God can, essentially, Benjamin Somner talks about essentially God is fragmenting himself, and he could be in a multiplicity of bodies at the same time. But it's still one self, one person who's doing this. Okay, so because typically what I would ask a modalist is if a Father and the Son and the Spirit are just simple ways that are modes that God can take on, then God is not the Father, he is not the Son, he's not the Holy Spirit. He's something other than that, who manifests himself, essentially puts on different masks, or he's somebody who's other than that, and he switches to the mode of the Father, switches to the mode of the Son, or
like
even can do them all.
Like a trickster. And I do see like why people would have an issue with that, because they kind of have this idea that God is playing a farce, that God is kind of putting on mask in the deceptive way. I'm not saying you're saying that, but I could see why some people have an issue with that. I see it in the way of the way we understand God as Father in what I have studied in the scriptures is simply the fact that God is the creator of heaven and earth. So he, by the act of producing life, by the act of giving life, because he is the life giver, the life-giving spirit. There is a passage in Hebrews 12, I believe, where it says that God is the Father of spirits. So we know in Genesis, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong in that quotation but I believe it's in Hebrews 12, where God is depicted as the Father of spirits. So if we go in Genesis 2, verse 4 to 6, it literally says that God the Father breathed in the nostrils of Adam, and Adam became a living soul. So prior to that, Adam was just an inanimate shell, just like a corpse, like a dead corpse. And God breathed in that body, in that material shell, and that literally was animated by the power of God. So I do see God in the sense that he is a father. He produces life. And we do have this ability, Andrew, in the flesh, but in a limited sense, right? You're going to be, again, a father. So the seed stems from the person Andrew. I had children as well, and I have that ability of giving life, but in a limited form, obviously, because it's in my own household. And we do see God producing life in the sense that he is the source. He is the source of all things. And I do see it also in the covenantal usage, because the pagans, they had no relationship with God, right? We do see this in prior to the New Testament. We do see the Gentiles severed from the covenant. So I do also see it in the covenantal usage. But I'll stop there, and I'll explain how I see the term Son and Holy Spirit.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And now I see why you're so against the term modalist, because it's just a way of it's just smoke screening,
right?
Essentially making obscure something that shouldn't be at all. We shouldn't really be having this conversation, having to battle against these Trinitarians. So you would say that at one time, God was not the Father.
So that is interesting. At one time, God was not the Father. I believe even Tertullian said this, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly. Correct.
But yeah, so let me just ponder on this, because I don't want to say anything like stupid. So at one time, God was not the Father. Well, I would have to say yes, because before that, there was no creation. In order for him to be the Father, well, God had to create. Exactly. And we do see that, right?
Yeah, so exactly, because the Trinitarians will often say, the nonsense. I think it started with like Augustine or something,
right?
Saying that, well, how is God the Father if he didn't have a son? And just you can't reason with that, I guess.
Yeah, the God is contingent. Literally, that means that in order for him to be the Father, the Son had to be eternal. From prior to all the ages that even man has experienced, they were actually in that loving relationship, in that perichoresis, nonsense.
Yeah, it seems like they always sort of see a contradiction and then formulate a doctrine that'll sort of get them through it. And then you're left with 10 different people saying 10 different contradictory things. But again, I'm glad we're having this conversation, because the whole bringing that modalist title down is really helpful, and I think it's something that's hindering persons like yourself from getting your point across, because before you even speak with anybody, they sort of have this idea about the nonsense of kind of, or like the confusion of modalism.
Right. Pigeonholed. You're right. Right.
Yeah. So, man, where to go next? I think we kind of have to go. Oh, okay, let's do this. You said that God is one divine spirit. There's one divine spirit that is God.
Yes.
But also, would you say that God is a person? You said God is a person. So
when I use the term person, I have to be honest, I'm using it in the modern sense. Individual. That would be a more precise way of explaining.
Someone who has consciousness,
self-existent,
and reason, things like this. Okay, yeah. I agree. That's how I use it too. I don't think Trinitarians know how they use it. They just sort of make it up.
They don't.
Yeah, it goes between.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I meant that in that regard, I do agree with you, because self-existence is literally defined in the term aseity. And they love using this term, aseity of God. Well, aseity literally means the self-existence of the individual entity or entity. So God in the Old Testament has a name, right? I am, Aya Sharaya, which is the self-existent one, the self-existing one. Mm-hmm. So he's not dependent on another person, another individual. He is his own, in authority. He is his own source, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. So I think the next step would be to talk about the logos.
Right.
Are you aware? And I know that everything that was said about Noetus and these earlier guys was by their adversaries, similar to what we have in Arius. But so, are you aware that anything that these figures said against Noetus and his understanding of the logos? Do we have any idea about what these earlier monarchians were saying about the logos?
No, because they burnt the writings. You have this in the history, the church history of Eusebius, and I have a copy. He literally says after the council was, it was official, the doctrine of the Trinity, at the Council of Nicaea. He literally says that the books of the heretics were confiscated, and they burnt it, and the property was seized by the state. The new Christian state. So that's a form of, Christian nationalism, which I think is very interesting. And they started to seize all the works of, people like Noetus, people like Sabellius, right? I haven't mentioned even Sabellius. He was a monarchian. And even the people like Arius, their writings were confiscated and burnt. and everyone that did not agree with the new doctrine was branded a heretic. They were literally driven out of their homes and killed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it just spiraled out of control. Obviously, then we get to the Council of Nicaea, it just seemed to be sort of the nail in the coffin.
Right.
Nobody's allowed to free think anymore, have any ideas. It's you believe this, what we've agreed upon as a, and the whole idea is Constantine wanting to have, believe Jesus was going to help him win wars and have power.
Right.
And decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and form this, not the church, a Roman emperor of all people, as if they weren't reading the New Testament at all.
Right.
Because obviously the New Testament is, especially Revelation, is completely against Rome. You're supposed to have one person who is Lord, and that's Christ, but yet they seem to bend the knee to the emperor, which is essentially sitting on the throne of Satan.
You're right. Even Athanasius, I believe, I've read those, the treatise of Athanasius. He literally exalts the Constantine. He literally says, our most pious emperor. That's like the most humble and religious person you can imagine. He literally says, our most pious emperor. And we're actually forbidden to actually elevate a man as in a godhood status, which they were actually doing, the Logos party. They were literally elevating this pagan emperor to godhood status with these great exalted titles.
Yeah, it's interesting, the Logos party or Logos party. I wouldn't I hear you. I wouldn't personally just lump everybody in together, but so again, it kind of goes back to like, what do you believe the Logos is? Because from my understanding, this began predominantly, like mainly with Philo.
Right.
But Philo did not teach that the Logos was a person. And Philo taught that there's only one truly existent one, which is God, who is the Father of all. And so it seems that you sort of have the telephone game throughout history where certain, I think that when you get to like Origen and Clement of Alexandria, you sort of have a more philosophical aspect of it. Now in Philo, I think a lot of confusion comes in for people because in Philo, the Logos was figuratively called the Son of God. But the Logos was not a person. It's a philosophical concept that essentially God produced this blueprint through which he made creation. And like, for instance, he could call wisdom the daughter of God, or even the wife of God.
A figure of speech.
Figure of speech, exactly.
Right.
So what does the Logos mean to you? Obviously, like one of the cruxes of all Christological conversation is, what is the Logos? We can eliminate all of Arianism and Trinitarianism by simply saying that the Logos is not a person.
Right.
So would you say that the Logos is a person, or how do you understand what the Logos is, especially in the context of John 1?
So I might address what you said about Philo later, but I will address John 1:1. It's interesting because in John 1:1 we do see that the word Logos is equated with God himself. So from my standpoint as a monarchian, and this is what they held that the word was the utterance of God, the speech of God. So when God spoke, remember I alluded to Genesis 2:4, 2:6, where God breathed, right, in the nostrils of Adam, and he became a living soul, a living being. So when God spoke, things happened. Things started to take shape. The world started to have a structure, order, And that's how we see it. We see that the word itself is not a distinct person from this person who is God, but we do see the word God himself. So if you remove my speech, Andrew, if I muzzle you, right, like the COVID-19, which we all experienced, if you're muzzled, how on earth can you express yourself? You're a dead person. There is no ability for you to express yourself in this world. And the scriptures actually allude that the power of life and death is in a person's tongue. So how much more for God himself?
I agree. And obviously, when we're going back, like you said, about the more Hebraic understanding and the memra and things like this, people would see it as something sort of separate from God, which I'll be bringing up in the debate, showing the contradictions. If people want to go to the Targums and try to say the memra is a separate person, it just shows you they only want to isolate certain things. They don't want to take a systematic approach to studying the Targums and seeing what all mentions of the Targums say. So two things, I guess, we could, about John 1 is the Logos is God. So I guess you would say, I don't want to. Well, I'll just ask you, how do you understand it, being that the Logos was with God and the Logos was God? What does it mean qualitatively that the Logos was God there in John 1:1c?
If you don't mind, I will parallel this question with two passages that I believe it's a perfect reflection of what John 1:1 is alluding to. If you read Romans 9:5, Ephesians 4, verse 4 to 6, it literally states in Romans 9:5 that Jesus Christ, who came according to the flesh, for the patriarchs, that according to the flesh, Christ came. So I think it's very interesting because it's already alluding to the Son in a sense where he is appearing to men in a visible form, flesh. And then it goes on to say, which person, Jesus, is God above all. Now that word in Greek is epipaton. Epipaton, the very same verbiage, the same expression is used in Ephesians 4, verse 4 to 6, where it says, we have one God, the Father, who is above all, in you all, and through you all, right? And that word above all is again that same Greek word, epipaton. You can check it for yourself. I actually mentioned this in the book that I just released, I published recently on the Monarchia. We hold to the monarchy. I actually show that in the Greek. So if the Son is equated as God above all, and you and I, we both know there is only one God, like you said, if we are making the case that Jesus Christ is God, he can only be the Father in that sense, and not a separate, distinct entity.
So that makes a lot of sense, and then we can kind of skip up the word becoming flesh, because I could see how you could see how is God. Do you see it as more of a paradox that just is beyond comprehension?
It sure is a paradox. I mean, we're still debating and arguing about this, right? But yes, it is a paradox in the sense that when we try to define God according to our limited knowledge, our carnal way, we actually get it completely wrong. Now, from I would say from an emotional standpoint, I will not use the word emotional. I would say from a salvific standpoint, I do see why God could come in a way that is familiar to man by manifesting himself as a real man in order to save us. And he tried the method of prophets. He tried the method of kings, right? It failed. It simply failed because you and I, we both know every man is a liar except God, right? And liar, I mean, in the sense that we all get it wrong at some point. We don't live up to that standard of perfection. So I would say from a salvific, I use the word emotional, and a sort of a deep, a heart issue. I do see that the Gospels are teaching that God was manifest in the flesh in order to purchase us with his own blood, as Acts 20 verse 28 stipulates. And this is how I was saved. I literally called upon God in order for him to clarify this misconception of, are you someone else in the Godhead? Are you the God who came to save mankind? So that's where I'm coming from, Andrew.
All right. I mean, we could go a million different ways, like salvation. So, but I think that's kind of another conversation, maybe
Sure.
for a later time.
Sure.
So if we have the Logos and it's with God, God, the God who the Logos is with is the Father, right?
Right.
And so the Logos is with God in what sense? As just like wisdom in Proverbs 8?
Yes, or as a man's word, right, is with him. It, like alluded to that example, if you remove the ability of man in order to express himself, there is no purpose, right? I actually know people that are close to my own family, where they actually have lost their own voice. And psychologically speaking, it has impacted their ability to socialize. It's rough. It's pretty rough. So yes, a man's speech is very, very important. Now, someone would say, "Oh, a mute person can communicate," but I would say, in the limited sense, that person couldn't be, run for office, right? Couldn't be in politics. Couldn't do a number of things that we can do. When I alluded to that passage where there is power of life and death in a man's speech, tongue. So how much more for God?
Yeah. So is Jesus the Logos in a literal, what would you say Jesus is the Logos? And if so, is it in a literal sense or a figurative sense?
I would say Jesus is the Word prior to his incarnation. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us.
So but the Word is sort of distinct from a person.
The Word is, yes, there is a distinction. There is a distinction in operation, right? You have a man, but if a man is mute, then he is not employing that ability to communicate, if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah. So we talked about, you said earlier about that God, when God speaks creation.
Right.
So Philo would say something like, or he does say something like, we're not to imagine God using sound waves like we would speak, but God's creation itself is the speech, if that makes sense. So we're not to imagine God, saying things literally. Obviously, God doesn't have a mouth or a body, so the act of creation itself is the speech.
I would say that I would not be in accordance, wholly in accordance with what Philo said, for the simple reason that I don't believe that God had a body of flesh and blood in his divine realm. And I do see that God, when he spoke the world into existence, it was a supernatural manifestation that you and I, we can only imagine. But yet, if we start to imagine, we will never, come to the right, answer, because we were not there, we were not present. But the scriptures do reveal a certain amount of information that gives us a picture that God has a voice, and that voice booms. It shakes the earth. It literally, the prophets talk about the voice of God shaking the earth. Now, I don't believe that's just in a moral sense, right? In the sort of that sense. I believe it's talking about shaking also in the literal sense, when God will cause earthquakes, when God will literally, in the book of Revelation, we actually see supernatural occurrences. So I do believe that in that idea that Philo is trying to allude to, he's basically saying we shouldn't imagine to the point where we're actually saying this is how it exactly looks like.
Yeah, I think it's more of a philosophical question, right? I mean, and see, I think a lot of people don't understand that even within Jewish thought. I mean, you know that you have the Jews who are under the rule of the Persians, and then the Greeks, and only at the New Testament time under the rule of the Romans. And so you sort of have this split in Jewish thought as well, especially like you said in Alexandria. The largest population of Jews outside of Jerusalem. Obviously, philosophy all around them. So
basically, if I can just chip in, I would say that, there is, I don't want to give, the wrong idea, but the Freemasons, they have drawn a lot of their ideas from Jewish rabbinic thought. When they say what is above, so below, they're literally saying, they're harking back to what Moses was commanded by God in order to reflect on earth, the tabernacle, all of these different vessels that, Moses had to make in order to reflect God's throne, in order to reflect God's kingdom. So I would say that God's kingdom is heightened. God's realm is supernatural. And what we see here on earth is only a glimpse. It's only, even Paul says, we see dimly, right? We're only seeing, shadows. And that's what I believe. I do believe that God has a supernatural body, but he's not dependent on that supernatural body. He pleases to have a form in order to communicate with his creation, if that makes sense, Andrew. Like we're made in his image. We have to remember that.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so that's a curveball. I just gotta I gotta ask you. So we're talking about God has a body. See, this is all is, and that's why I love having this conversation, because let's get back to the heart. Let's talk about
Right.
the cultural context in which the Bible was written, because Trinitarianism is just completely fruitless, and they seem to have walked 1,000 miles in the wrong direction. But because we're talking about God and how, and that's what I was saying about there's an interesting article by Dragos Julia. It's called "The Noetic Turn in Jewish Thought," and
The
essentially
Noetic?
the Noetic, right? And so what he says is that, especially with Philo, beginning with Philo, essentially, but I think even Aristobulus before him, is these categories about God and angels and sort of things are transformed into Noetic categories. And so it began
Right.
to be things, essentially an intellectual ascension in order to see God. And essentially it ties into what you were saying about, God being so far above us and not being able to understood.
Right.
And so even things like visions and dreams and angels are transformed into Noetic categories.
Sure.
And so this is all, so it becomes philosophical, because you would ask the question, well, what does God's voice sound like? And how do you know for sure that it's God's voice you're hearing? Is it something that is imposing on your mind, or is it something that
It's a revelation.
you're becoming perceptive to it, a revelation? But what is the means through which you're having this revelation?
Right.
I mean, like
That
yeah.
Sure. No, if you wanted to finish your thought, go ahead.
No, I just mean like for instance, was it Peter, and he's having this this he essentially falls into a trance when God's telling him about this the Gentiles being included in, and he's having this scroll appear, I guess, and he's having this vision. Well, the question is, well, what happened there? Is this something he was seeing with his physical eye? Is it something that his essentially his spiritual self was opened up to some realm?
That could be a possibility.
And it's all possibilities, but
Right.
that's philosophically is what people like Philo were getting into and sort of answering and saying, well, how do these things take place?
Can I answer
Yeah,
in regards to
please.
that? So I would say, wouldn't you think and I would answer it by question, and I will give you a proper answer in that regard. Wouldn't you think it's improper to speculate on these matters, on visions, on things that pertain to the scriptures, if we have never had a personal encounter with the divine?
I mean, so perhaps it could be, right? It could be just vanity, and it could be a sense of pride, and so now the thing about having experiences is a lot of people say that they have them, but it's not something like, if I told you I had an experience, I couldn't transpose that onto your brain to make it 100% believable, because but experience trumps what people talk about, right?
True.
So for me personally, I have had this sort of revelation. Actually one of my kids was stillborn, and I'm in the hospital, and I didn't think anything of it. I'm just praying, and this is why I'm not against the monarchianism, because when I was saved, I just called out to Jesus, and I know that I was saved and my life was radically changed. I was delivered from all of these things that bind me, and I was made new. So I would never downplay that.
I understand.
Or criticize that. And so I'm sitting here, and I didn't think anything of it, and Jesus, please come take my child's soul. And all of a sudden I fell into this trance, and this being came towards me, and I felt this energy with like the purest love that I've ever felt in my life. It was pure love. It was something that was otherworldly. And
I've experienced it as well, but that's why I believe you.
Yeah. So you know that when you have that sort of experience, it's life changing.
It is.
You're never going to be the same. Nobody's ever going to be able to tell you that God doesn't exist or anything like this. And
I agree.
And so, but I would ask myself, and you're right though, and that's because there is a point where it can become vanity. It may be vanity to speculate on it all. Definitely, I don't like when people say things like, well, what happens to us when we die? Oh, we definitely go and sleep and things like this. You can speculate, but there's a point where it just becomes like a sort of prideful vanity, I think.
I agree.
Yeah, so but you're right. There is a point. If we're trying to put God in a box and say, I understand exactly how God operates,
true,
that is prideful. That is vanity. Within ourselves, I think if we're asking, well, if God speaks to me or he reveals himself to me in whatever way it happens, how does it happen? That might be a different matter, but that is a good point. That definitely should have a urge of caution.
Right. And I wholeheartedly agree with you, Andrew. I feel you in regards to that experience, because I've experienced it as well. And I also know the vanity and the deceptiveness of false visions. I have experimented in my years of sin with drugs, with recreational drugs. The worst experience I had, and it was a life-changing, was on magic mushrooms. It was Mexican type, the ayahuasca version. And I had that in Amsterdam, and it was a supernatural experience. Like you said with Peter, the trance. And I'm not going to get into all the science of how it affects the blood, and it goes in your bloodstream, and that opens certain, portals through these biological doors in our body. But it is an attested fact that it does open you to these levels of perception, these levels of a hyper-dimensional gateways. So I experienced that, and I know for a fact there are entities out there. I know, watching us, either good or bad. And I had the bad experience, and I called on the name of Jesus. I literally invoked God by thinking of Jesus, and the experience stopped. So people can have qualms with me in that regard, but I've lived it, and it works.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. And so, that name, it can't be
Has
underestimated. It does.
Has power. Yeah.
It does. And it's just hard for me as a Unitarian, especially, because when I was saved, it wasn't by reading a book or doing all these sort of things. It's coming to a point in your life, calling on the name of Jesus in absolute place you can't, So I don't downplay that, and I don't necessarily. I would never say it's impossible. Like that's more of an ideological argument to say, well, God can't become a man and these sort of things. And it's like, well,
sure.
I think it's contrary to. It's not about whether what's possible or not, and it's still an amazing event. And I think there's a ton of evidence that would support that. It's just a matter of.
So I have a question for you, Andrew. I didn't mean to derail your thought.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah, I was there.
No. I wanted to ask you this question. Do you see the Trinitarian view of the Christology of the Trinitarian view as I would say the most logical and better form of viewing God as Jesus? Or would you see it in the Monarchian view that Jesus is viewed as the Father himself? Now, which view would be, I would say you would favor the most if we're making the case of a personal God that loves his creation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would obviously, if Jesus was God, he would have to be the Father incarnate,
right?
And how would we explain that? I think it's easy. It's very easy to say, well, God could create a human being, especially when we take into consideration the virgin birth. God could easily just act through this person. If he puts his spirit on him, God could act through this person. And in that sense, it's like God being a person. The Trinitarian view is probably just the most fruitless. It's just really kind of a satanic in the way that it derails us from any perception. It's just like a brain rotting doctrine. And I don't think that we need to be hyper intellectual. We don't need to be. The Bible tells us that, right? It's just a matter of what's good and what's evil. True. Anybody can do that, right? Then there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of evidence that you could make a strong case for Jesus being the Father incarnate. Obviously, the before Abraham was I am, if depending on how you understand that, or when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If we're to follow the whole Bible and take into all the things into consideration, we can't conclude anything except for God is one person.
Right.
Then we read the writings of Paul, and there's some very lofty things that are said about Jesus that we can't dismiss.
Right.
And that I don't think Paul meant them. I think Paul meant them in a very lofty way. To what extent is debatable.
Can I ask you a question in that regard? And this will fringe on idolatry. Now, this is going to be like obviously a question that, we're going to have to give like serious thought, you and I. Passages like Isaiah 48:11, right? I will not yield. I will not give my glory to another. That word in Hebrew is adhered, and it literally means someone else. Like you're adding to that unit, right? So plus. And you also have it in Isaiah 42:8, where it says, my name is will not be polluted. I'm paraphrasing. And I will not yield my glory. So it's the name of God is literally interchangeably associated with the glory, literally with the glory of God, and that he will not give that to just a man, someone else, to avoid idolatry, because and I know, Exodus 20 verse 3 states, you will have no gods before me. You will literally not worship, exalt someone else. And we live now in an age, a narcissistic age, where men and women are literally committing idolatry every single day. Now, don't you see that in the Unitarian sense, that you could fall into that camp, and obviously in the Trinitarian, but do you see that in the Unitarian camp? And I'm not debating with you, my dear Andrew.
Yeah, no, I don't see it like that. Yeah.
Do you see that you could fall into that category by, making a hard distinction between the man Jesus and God the Father, that he is bestowed glory and that we can see him in that elevated position, and that could, lead us in idolatry if one is not careful?
If one is not careful, absolutely. So it depends. For instance, I think it's First Chronicles 29:20. I believe that we see, when Solomon's becoming enthroned, and David says, worship the Lord your God. And it says that they bowed down and paid homage or worshiped the God, Yahweh, and the king. And it's one verb, but two direct objects. And so the worship is going directly to the living God as well as the human Messiah.
Okay. That's a fair argument. And I would say, okay, but what do you think of this response? In regards to that passage you've alluded to, I alluded to 1 Samuel 8 and 1 Samuel 12. And I was making the case that God is ultimately king, right, of Israel. And Israel failed to see God as the ultimate source of worship, right? They fell into idolatry. They fell into the worshiping other gods. They literally demanded another king, a human king. Now, we know that the pagans, around Israel, they worshipped kings as God. Nimrod, literally Tammuz in Babylonian, a myth is they were worshipped as gods. So do you see that, in that passage you've alluded to, that this is more like God saying, show respect to the king, that you literally asked me that I should give you this king, but I'm not condoning worship to this king. Ultimately, I get the worship, but I'm actually showing you a picture of a future event where I literally will be worshipped. You have that in the book of Zechariah. It literally says that all nations will worship him and him alone. That word, I think it's Yachid. I might be wrong, but it's alone. Literally, the Lord will be worshipped alone as king on that day. I think it's Zechariah 14 verse 9. What are your thoughts on that? About the king, monarchia factor?
I think we see in Christ something obviously greater than David or Solomon or any other king there's ever been. Especially when we read the elevated things that Paul says about Christ being this mystery hidden before the foundation of the world, and so one in First Chronicles 29:23, we go down and it says that Solomon sat on the throne of Yahweh.
Right.
And that's a pretty lofty thing. We see the same thing with Christ sitting on his Father's throne. But I think that there's two things that kind of tie in together. One is that in 1 Corinthians 15, we sort of read about this power structure, and also in Colossians 1, that God has bestowed this man with this unusual power. It's the greatest power. And what's so interesting about First Corinthians 15 is that it says that then the Son will hand the power back to the Father. And I think that's an extremely lofty thing to say. But also, depending on how we understand the whole dynamic of power within the cosmos, for instance, Satan is called the god of this world.
Right.
And so if we see that there's sort of this chaos and rebellion in the spiritual world with these Satan and the demonic forces, we see this man who's given this power in order that all of his enemies, which would be either in the spiritual realm or the earthly realm, to be put under his feet. But then in First Corinthians 15, it goes on to say that when this is accomplished, then he will hand back the power to God the Father and will become subordinate. He will be put under the Father so that God may be all in all. And so that God may be all in all would be more in line with what you're saying in Zechariah, that his name be one. Also, along this same thing, we see in John 17:3 that Jesus says that this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. And so, and then even in Paul, there's this turning away from idols back to the true and living God. So at the end of the day, like when it's all said and done, according to Paul, all at the end of the day, Christ will be subordinate even within the created realm, and all that glory will go back to God the Father.
That's okay. That's interesting. I would say in that regard, first of all, you mentioned 1 Corinthians 15. I find it interesting that in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45, it literally says that the first Adam was made a living soul, Nefesh in Hebrew, and it says that the last Adam was a life-giving spirit. That's in the King James. In the Aramaic, it says the last Adam is the life-giving spirit. Now, we only know one God who created all things, the Father, who breathed in the nostrils of Adam, right? Who produced all things. So to equate the last Adam, Jesus, I believe this is talking about Jesus, as the life-giving spirit, either Paul is preaching idolatry, or either he's revealing something that the Israelites did not realize in the time of Christ, that he is actually expounding upon, saying, this is our God who revealed himself, as Isaiah 9:6 says, for unto us a child is born, for unto us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father. And if you read down to verse 7, it literally says that the kingdom will be on his shoulder, and that his rule will be an everlasting kingdom. His dominion will be an everlasting dominion. That's forever. So in regards to that passage where you were alluding to the Son giving back the authority, in your words, because we'll have to read that verbatim, giving it back to the Father, I would interpret that in the sense that we know that there is the millennium, and that Christ will have that dispensation as judge, right? And that all the nations should come and worship the King. And if they don't come, they will receive plagues. And I believe after the millennium, that capacity, that form where, God is visible as a man, it will be now in the capacity, in the way where he will be everywhere at once, and he will not be judge. he will no longer need to correct people, right? Because we know during the millennium, at the end of the millennium, there is a revolt, the Gog and Magog revolt. So I believe that passage is teaching he will no longer need to judge. At that point, he is with his children, the better part that have accepted him forever. Could you entertain that idea that it's no longer needed for a judge, and that's what that passage is alluding to?
Yeah, I can entertain it. I think the problem is, and again, we don't have to say definitively what something is when we're talking about the nature of God. But I think a problem with the argument is that you have God and then you have Jesus, and so you have two separate things. And then
I just wanted to chip because I will forget this. Does not the scriptures teach that all judgment is given to the Son?
Yes.
So that would allude to God, again, the forms, the offices, the functions of the same God. He's basically saying that function is going to be obsolete. He won't be needed anymore. Evil will be vanquished. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I'm just thinking that I don't know what your view is about. I think we get into a couple different things. If we talk about the end time, so I have a video on my channel. It's called The Meta Narrative of the Bible, Part 1. And I talk about temple theology and how it sort of begins in Eden with Adam as the high priest, and it ends in Revelation when the New Jerusalem becomes the Holy of Holies. And so I don't know. And then, these still seems like the nations are on the outside sort of. So the question is, I mean, I think these are questions that we don't really have all the answers to, but that we'll have to speculate about if we want to form any conclusion, because then it's like, well, okay, are human beings, what kind of bodies are we going to have? Paul says it's kind of a foolish question because we're going to have a spiritual body.
Like the angels in heaven.
Yeah. So, but are they going to look like these bodies? Are we going to be able to eat things, digest things? That's a natural process of that, you're dying essentially, right? I mean, you're eating, you're living or dying.
Well, can we both agree that we'll have supernatural bodies and that we won't need to go to the putty? We won't need to go to right. I don't see heaven like that. I see it like
it's heaven on earth. Do you see heaven as okay?
I do. The New Jerusalem literally comes, but not on this earth. Obviously, this earth will be obsolete. As Jesus said, I make all things new. There will be new heaven and a new earth.
Yeah. So then we get into another conversation that and I don't think, and that's why I love that we're here in this conversation. We just all the noise is gone now. Now we can have adult conversations. But because I don't see it like I see that this earth will be recreated, but not in the sense that not in the sense that there's going to be a brand new earth, but rather that things will be restored back into their original pre-fall state.
Purged? Could we use like
I mean, not annihilated.
Sure. Yeah. But like I would say like sanctified, purged, everything that is rotten. I mean, you see all the chemtrails, right? The food poisoning, all of that needs to go away. We need to get back to that form of the Garden of Eden, right? Where we're eating healthy, where, we have that form of existence. But I believe it's going to be even better. I really believe that, Andrew. And we're talking about God.
Yeah.
We're literally talking about God who created all this. I mean, it's like in these conversations, like even with that thought, I'm not saying you're doing it, but, why would we limit it just to that? Couldn't it be even something more heightened? Do you see where I'm going with this? I mean, we're talking about God.
I think our brains, I don't think we can comprehend it, obviously. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, so we keep pressing. But one thing I would say that, so this is where I come from. The way I think is kind of more philosophical, dealing with the existential questions that we have, namely, who am I? Why am I here? What's my purpose in life, and how am I supposed to act? And so when I look at the Bible is it's the supreme religious text we have,
Right.
and it gives us all these answers. And so if we're talking about the logos and the way that Philo understood it in its purest sense before it was essentially took the wrong turn, a little bit of the leaven was added, I guess you could say,
Right.
So Philo would say that before God created anything, he created the blueprint about how things should be, and that's essentially what the good is, like in Plato. And you have this sort of everything that is good and all of the ideas that are good. God had an intended way that they should be. So he created everything, and we know that when God created everything on earth, it was perfect. All right. And then God places Adam in, and then through Adam, he introduces chaos and death back into the world. And so then I guess we get into the question of, how is the kingdom of God going to be manifest on earth? Is it going to happen through you and I? Like, do we have a responsibility
Sure we do.
Yeah. So then we have to say, well, objectively, how do we know what is good? And how do we know what it's supposed to look like? Because these things aren't really explicitly stated. Like you're asking me, what do you think it will be like? I don't think we know for sure. And it's probably greater than anything we could ever imagine. But nonetheless, if we're working towards something, because it goes all the way back to the state of the world, all the state of the world is opposed to what is good.
Don't you think that God can give you like hints, very, very explicit hints of what it might look like in order to arouse hope? And so you keep pursuing the truth and on the narrow path, like you alluded to. Your experience was a real experience, right? And he showed you that the benevolence. He showed you that kindness. He showed you that love, that really supernatural love that you can't put in words. Don't you think that those experiences are kind of like a piece of a puzzle, that when you collect that, you start to get this picture, and in line with the scriptures, God reveals these things to you, and we're not speculating. I'm not saying you are, but it goes now beyond the realm of, philosophy. And I don't like that word, because I believe in revelation. I really do believe in direct revelation from God, like Moses. I mean, Moses spoke to God face to face, like a man speaks to his friend. Do you believe that?
Well, it's just it kind of comes back to the philosophical thing of like,
right.
what actually took place, right? What actually happened, right?
I do have another question, Andrew. Sorry. In regards to Philo, would you not see Philo's teaching with an eye of suspicion, given the fact that he was Hellenized, right? He originally, as a Jew from the Hebrew faith, he was in Alexandria, and we do know that a lot of the Jews in Alexandria, they started to merge the Hebrew faith with this Gentile way of reasoning, but it's a reason that was not given by revelation. Do you see how that could conflict with a faith that was once delivered in the revelatory sense?
And that's a fair concern. And I think I see that even among most Unitarians, if not every single Unitarian that I know. I might be the only one who loves philosophy and loves Philo in that way. One, because I see that he actually, if we break everything down, he doesn't contradict, in my opinion, the Hebrew faith. I think it's more of an evolution of understanding. And number two, I believe that we see it all throughout the New Testament. I'll give an example. there was the story of the old philosophical thing about the handmaid, and the handmaid in the once you have the handmaid, and then you have the true wife. The handmaid is and it uses the story of Sarah and Hagar. This is so the old philosophical story is that once essentially once when Abraham mated with the handmaid before he mated with Sarah, who was the begot who is it Isaac,
Isaac,
right? And
right?
he was the child of the promise, but was it
Hagar,
who Ishmael was
Ishmael
not.
is the son. Yeah, right.
And
The
so the old
bondage.
philosophical thing, I don't have it exactly who it was, was that the handmaid was seen as something that was necessarily temporary. It was something you had to do first, but once you had the true wife, which was Sarah, you have to reject the handmaid, right?
Correct.
And that's exactly what we see in the Hebrew Bible. And
Right.
so Philo would see this. He's like, whoa, no. First of all, like following like Aristobulus, Philo actually taught that Plato and these philosophers actually learned from Moses, who was the supreme philosopher, right? So we see the story of this handmaid, and then we see so for Philo, he would see that there was a sort of knowledge which is encyclical. It goes in circles. It's uh, uh, propedeutic. It's like a necessary amount of knowledge, like that someone would go through before moving on to loftier forms of understanding. And what's interesting is we see this exact same thing in Paul. In Galatians 3 and 4, he talks about how the law was essentially this propedeutic elementary understanding, which should have led us to Christ, who is this fuller revelation. And he talks about how the law was a schoolmaster. This was, the word they use there it talks about essentially a tutor, which these elementary kids would get back in the day in Roman times, to teach them the sort of the elementary things when they're young children. But we
Right.
should be moving on to maturity. And so we
I agree.
see that there's not really a contradiction there. They all kind of intertwine. You see the philosophical story of the handmaid and the true wife. Then you see Philo reading this story, but then it's also corroborated by Paul. And so,
But do you see how the case could be made? And this is where I'm leaning towards to. Do you see how the case could be made that, okay, Philo is making the case that all of these Greek intellectuals basically had the revelation from Moses, but how come he is the only rogue witness and we're not hearing it from other brothers? Because the scripture says that out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the truth is established. Don't you see that? How could, they arouse qualms in the fact that this is coming from him as one witness, but our other brothers in the Jewish faith are actually echoing what Philo of Alexandria is saying, that, there are, these intellectual, Greeks that received it directly from Moses. We would have to see this.
Well, from my understanding, we do. And there was a pretty common thought among Jewish philosophers. I believe Aristobulus, who precedes Philo by 100 years or so, said the same exact thing. One, I don't know how literal he means it.
Right.
I don't know if he's saying that it literally happened, or if he's just saying that Moses was the original because he wrote far before.
Right, like a model, like a sort
Yeah.
of a model, but in the sort of a philosophical sense. Yes.
Right, because a lot of historians will say that actually the Hebrew is like Moses learned from the Egyptian traditions which preceded them. Right.
You know who else made that case? Albert Pike.
Oh wow!
I've read Albert Pike, Morals and Dogma. He actually literally says that. He says that Moses received a greater revelation actually from those who preceded him that were into Egyptian mystery schools, the Greek mystery schools. And this is where I'm like, alarm bells. I'm like, wait a minute, they were not given the precepts. And even Paul says, to the oracles and the prophecies, the promise to the Jew first, then the Gentiles. And I think there is a structure there for a reason, not to say that the Jews are better, not to say that they did not keep, that they kept God's law to perfection, because we know the story. They actually fell just as we fall in our carnal nature into errors. They fell into deep errors, worshipping idols, right? False gods. But the case I'm making is God is setting a pattern in regards to that promise he gave to the patriarchs. Does that make sense? That the patriarchs who were faithful to God, God made that promise. He's like, I am going to take care of your, future generations, your children. I will attempt to reveal this truth, and it will be through that line. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And so we're right here in this conversation. So what for Philo he was a devout Jew as well. And so he was he loved Moses, and he loved God. He loved these stories. So it's a little bit of a story. We don't have too much information about his life except for what he wrote about himself and what we can piece together and what a few people have said about him. But he grew up in a very wealthy family and had access to education in Alexandria and learned all these philosophical things. I think what he's trying to do is kind of jump ahead of the curve in a lot of ways and kind of show that, as we know, and anybody can truly find out, if you study all of the religions and all of the schools of thought, you'll see that the Bible contains the supreme revelation of God, right?
Right.
And the best insight we'll have to his character in written form all throughout history. And I think what is Acts 7:22-25, it talks about how Moses was learned in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians. But then the question is, well,
but he counted it for nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the point. And this is the point of what I don't think a lot of people grasp about. This is why I believe, and I've come to the conclusion of why John is writing what he's writing, is because in that time, Moses, even in Philo, Moses was the supreme revealer of God. He was the living embodiment of the law. And you talked about God, seeing God, how we're going to see God.
Right, yeah. Right.
And so in Philo, even in Philo, he has Moses ascending up. Sees it on like the Sabbath day. Moses ascends up into the darkness where God was and searched, but couldn't see God. And he decided that it wasn't in vain, but that God can be apprehended by no one. But in the Gospel of John, we see almost that, not a polemic, but a lesser to greater, where now Jesus becomes the supreme revealer of God, because Jesus says, everything I do, I've seen God do. I have seen God. And so...
I have a question in regards to the revealing, God showing himself. Do you see that, from a philosophical standpoint, and I don't like that word, but I will use it for this discussion. Do you see that there is a uniqueness when we are conversing and socializing with, people of the same, family tree, mankind, that there is something unique when you talk to someone face to face, when you see someone's face? Can you agree that there is a uniqueness in the way of communication that we don't get in the animal kingdom, that we don't get, if we're, conversing alone, that there is that intimacy when you're facing a man or anyone, of the mankind face to face. There is that interaction, that intimacy, which you don't get when you're alone.
So is this back to Moses having a conversation with God face to face?
Face to face.
So then,
and yet God did not reveal his face, right? It says that no man can see my face and live.
So it must be figurative then.
Well. I see it like in the sense of, would it not be both? Would it not be both? Would it not be in the sense where he is literally he has a supernatural face, and it's also talking about knowing God in an intimate sense? Coming back to your figure of speech, that it's talking about the intimacy, God's heart, like the mind of God. No man can know. I believe it's both.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's where we're asking the question, but then, like we said, we don't want to be, we don't want it to be vanity, but it's good to sort of to think about.
The glory of God is in the face of Jesus Christ. I mean, what do you do with that text?
Well, that's I was going to go to that because I have a video. I have a video on this, and a lot of people I think I've cracked the code about what this text is saying, because it talks about the Spirit of the Lord and these sort of things, but and the Spirit of the Lord but where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty, and these sort of things. So what does that mean? It took a lot of back and forth, but
I see you actually being okay with ignorance, which I will not have qualms with you on that. I believe it's a good thing to be ignorant of certain things pertaining to God, because it just gives more of good things to look forward to. It's a progressive revelation. But I'm careful when I say that, because I know some will say, well, the Trinity was a progressive revelation, and you're simply not getting it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm a big proponent of not putting God in a box. I don't like that with Trinitarians. I don't like it with preachers. I don't like it with Unitarians. Right. I'm very unbiased. I'm not committed to either one.
That's right, Sister Sherry.
And when that freedom was taken from people, and then God was put in a box and put up on a shelf and used for power, then it became the church and synagogue of Satan.
Yes.
Essentially. It's all about power. The whole thing is. Yeah. So when we talk about seeing God, and this is a big thing in the Gospel of John, this was a big thing with Philo. Their thought was right where we're at, right in this conversation. I don't discount the idea that I don't know exactly what happened when God was speaking and how, exactly. This is how God did it, and I have God figured out.
Sure.
And how God, we don't know, but we can deduce certain things.
Yes, that was my point.
Yeah. So, but the Bible is very clear, the New Testament, that no one has ever seen God at any time.
Except
but the Son has. It says the Son. What it actually says that the only begotten God would be the earliest manuscript going back to Alexandria, but that's just a point of contention.
Sure.
But
if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. John 14, verse 8-9.
Yeah. But the question is, but this really goes back to Philo, in my understanding, because Philo would say these things. Seeing God didn't become about literally seeing with your eyes. The same way when we see Jesus, that's not what God looks like.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Would if you were hearing my voice just on tape, would you see me in the same way than if you're actually seeing me now and interacting with me now? Yes, we're not in the physically face to face, but do you see that there is that uniqueness that you don't get when you don't have that interaction, that visible interaction, and it does satisfy man's soul? In that regard.
I agree, and in a very real sense, that obviously we would agree that that's what Jesus is, right? And the Bible is clear about that he is the image of the invisible God. It's right. Some way that God has revealed himself. The question, I think, where we would differ is, how does God do it? Not in a sense where we have to put God in a box, but what can we deduce? And what options can we sort of eliminate as the most improbable? For instance, Jesus says that all of these words I'm speaking, they're not my own. And so the question is, well, when Jesus says, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father, what does he mean? Because it can't be, because Jesus was born at a particular time. Even if God manifested himself in a particular body in old times, I think we can deduce that he didn't look like Jesus.
Well, I would respond with the following. Don't you see exalted statements where Jesus says in Matthew 11:27, no one has seen the Father except the Son, and no one knows who the Father is except the Son, and no one knows who the Son is except the Father, and those to whom he chooses to reveal him.
Yeah.
Don't you see a oneness there that goes back to your question that is so unique that certainly somehow God is showing us something in the incarnation, and that it is the mystery of godliness, as 1 Timothy 3:16 states. God was manifest in the flesh, that God is actually appealing to man's deepest desires, that I want to see you in the visible sense, and also in the sense of I want to know you intimately, according to the heart, that they both go hand in hand. There is a satisfaction with such a manifestation.
Well, I think what would be implied is that God doesn't know us before an incarnation. And I also don't deny that an incarnation happened, but I think it's just about what was incarnated, I guess you could say. What became incarnate in Jesus, and how do we explain that dynamic? Now, for me, I'm not going to attempt to explain any dynamic unless I believe that it's a sort of existential answer, a communication from God that's revealed in the Bible, and so I believe
could
that
you? Sorry.
that wisdom became incarnate in Christ, and then more than that, the logos, which is essentially, I'll put it like this is how I understand it. If you walk into a house, a complex building,
Right.
you can discern with your mind all of the different parts and pieces, and it will give you insight into the mind of the architect, which is God. Now,
Right.
the blueprint itself is not God, but it is God, right? It's a manifestation of God's mind. So in that sense, it's God, but not in a literal sense.
Sure.
This is exactly how Philo saw the logos as far as man in the cosmos. When you go look at all of creation, you can't see God himself, but you can see God's mind expressed in creation. And when you mentally contemplate or intellectually try to comprehend these things, you get insight into the mind of God. And so the same thing with the logos is how we understand the nature of God. And so that is what became incarnate in Christ. And then Christ continues to make only the one true God known.
Would that be like a kind of an avatar?
No, because, so again, my view is different from every single Unitarian. This is why I don't associate with any Unitarians. Before this reason, one, I don't like you, I don't like to put God in a box, because then all of our spiritual freedom is taken. I'm not open to God at that point, right?
Sure.
And two is that how I see it is the same thing that Moses talked about. Philo talked about Moses ascending up into the darkness where God was. When Philo ascended up, he became the embodiment of the law. It's a Greek term. It's called the nomos and sukos, which is the animated law. But in the Gospel of John, it would have Jesus. Now again, when it says the Word became flesh, it doesn't tell us when the Word became flesh. That is something that we have to read into it. It just says the Word became flesh. It doesn't say at what point, at what time. A lot of adoptionists will say that it happened at the baptism. I don't believe that either. I believe he was just anointed with the Spirit, which probably empowered him to over the course of his life grow in knowledge and wisdom, like we read in Luke. And so at some point in his life, he became the embodiment through comprehension and the Spirit of God. He became the embodiment of the Logos. And I think it's in a figurative but yet real sense.
So how would you see in John 1 where it says, and he was in the world, referring to the Word, and the world was made by him, right? Right?
Yeah.
The world was made by him, and the world knew him not. It's very interesting because in 1 John 3, verse 1 to 3, the author says, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called sons of God. Therefore the world knew him not. Don't you see a parallel where he's saying the world knew him not, and yet we are sons of God?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never considered the exact dynamic about the world knew him not. And you're saying that's from 1 John?
That's 1 John 3, verse 1 to 3, and the direct antecedent is the Father. And it literally says, the world knew him not. Dearly beloved, now we are the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. That's the future resurrection. But we shall see him as he is. And every man that hath this hope in him will purify himself even as he is pure. Don't you see that this is talking about a literal manifestation? The author is literally paralleling this fact that the world was ignorant of this God, and yet we will see him.
Yeah, I do. And so I would definitely see, obviously, that John 3 being a reference back to God.
Right.
And knowing God. The question is, how do we know God? And how do we know what we know about God is true?
Right.
And ultimately, what we know about God and his nature,
his creation,
what he intends for us. How do we know that? So for me, the Logos is how God is known. Because the Bible says no one has ever seen God at any time, but the monogamous theos, which again is this figurative second God, Philo could call it, but only in the sense of the architect metaphor, where essentially the blueprint is the second God. But it's not a distinct person, it's a manifestation, but it's an exact image of God's mind. And it's all that can be understood about God. And so think about this. Let's say that we lived in some random country like Japan, back before we've ever even heard of the Bible or the Israelites or any of these things. How do we know anything? How do we know anything about God? How do we know anything?
What is truth?
Exactly.
I like that. Quid est veritas. Yeah, Pilate actually said that.
In John.
Yet Jesus said, every man that have heard, hears my voice, basically alluding that he is the truth. And then Pilate says, what is truth? But he just told you that every man that hears his voice hears the truth. I mean, it's like, I just see that as a giveaway, like Jesus is hinting like a wink, wink. You've got the truth standing right in front of you in a visible form, and I am that embodiment of truth.
But he says in the book,
the truth.
But he says these words that I speak to you are truth in their life, but these words are not my own.
Sure.
These words were given to me from someone else who is his God.
Would you see that, he is talking to an audience clearly that are not identifying Jesus as God because they're only judging according to the appearance? They've got literally a man in front of him, and he's like trying to allude to them. I'm not a man proclaiming myself as God, ascended to godhood status. I'm trying to reveal you a deep mystery that you're not able to apprehend yet. And we see this in John 14, John 16, where he literally expounds the mysteries of the kingdom. He literally says to his disciples, the mysteries are given to you, but to them I speak in parables. So do you see that God will conceal certain truths to people that are profane? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Jesus says this himself, right? He's like, Lord, Father of heaven and earth, I praise you because you have hidden these things from the wise and prudent, but revealed them to the babes.
Right.
I don't discount the possibility, because then I would be putting God in a box. I just don't. I'm trying to understand what the text is saying. From my understanding, the development of my understanding, I understand the Bible as as an answer book to the
Sure.
existential questions of mankind.
I agree.
And so it's possible, but I think we don't. I think we have to. I think we do have a lot of clues in the Gospel of John, which gives us insight into the dynamic of what John is saying. And a lot of these things about like being born again from above, this word anathen, it can,
Right.
like a lot of words in John, it can mean both things, but really both things are needed in order to grasp what the author's saying.
Sure.
That idea already existed in Philo, 50 years before John. Philo says that the second birth of the philosopher is better than the first, and he talks about the contrast between your mortal self is born of mortal parents, but you need to be born from God above, who is the Father of all. And this is exactly what the author of the Gospel of John is saying. And I believe this is exactly what he has Jesus saying when Jesus says, no one has ascended except he who descended.
Right.
And so, but that word ascended is sort of, it's already happened. And so the question is, well, when did Jesus ascend? What does it mean that he has ascended? And this already exists in Philo when it talks about a second birth is better than the first. So the idea about being born again or being born from above already existed. And from my understanding, the author is, I think he's influenced by Targumic interpretation, but also Philo.
Could we make the sorry, Andrew, could we make the case that according to the theophanies in the Old Testament, now this is something I think we should probably just talk about, and I don't want to take too much of your time, Andrew, but I am enjoying this discussion. Do you see these theophanies in the Old Testament, Genesis 18, other passages where God, speaks to Moses, where God appears to Jacob and he wrestles with Jacob? We clearly see God ascending back to his realm, to heaven. Don't you think that could be also alluding to past events where God came down to converse with men and then he ascended back to heaven already in the times of the patriarchs? Are you familiar with Baruch? Baruch 3 literally says that, God came down and conversed with men, talked with men.
Yeah, so it's all about kind of how we understand the dynamic. So we have like three things going on. We have the original Hebrew Bible, and what it says about God. We'll use two examples about the three men who ate lunch with Abraham,
Genesis
and then
18,
the
right?
angel who wrestled with Jacob. Jacob, right?
Right.
Okay, sorry. My brain's so filled with other stuff, but so when we go into the I guess I don't know, the Targums, which is for those not
Aramaic?
familiar, yes, the Aramaic translation, but they also paraphrased and added a lot to the original text, where they would sort of not just translate but expound on things. And they said that of the story of Abraham, that this was three angels who only appeared as men, and also that these three angels were sent each one for a distinct purpose, because his explanation there is that each angel can only have one mission at a time. But also it says that he didn't even really eat, that he only just appeared to eat. And then the same thing with I'm not I'm not too sure about the angel that wrestled with Jacob, but it's the same sort of thing where these are just like men appearing to be angels. And again, the word or that memra is not the person, it's the revelation itself, it's the communication. And God has spoken it many times in many different ways, in manifold ways, but in these last
Hebrews
times,
1:1, right?
right.
But well,
So
do you see? I just wanted to interject there, Andrew. Do you see this passage that warns us of, giving primacy to these commentaries and interpretations? I'll give you this passage where it says we should not, no man can, consult the scriptures by private interpretation. So scripture is not given by private interpretation, which is like man saying, I'm adding my own, magic. And literally, this is how I see the event unfolding. And that could be dangerous because we know Paul literally warned of wolves that would infiltrate the church, that they would deceive the simple. So don't you see that there is that argument in regards to we have to be careful that, we shouldn't just take these commentaries for face value and probably, and I would say most rightly, consult God himself in order to reveal the truth directly from the scriptures, the text itself. The Talmud is filled with commentaries on the Torah, right? And the Talmud is a controversial book because not everything in the Talmud is exalting Jesus in how you and I see Jesus. Do you see that there is that argument where we should beware?
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is why, a lot of I think Trinitarians like to look back on the Targums and they see some little thing they think resembles the Trinity, and they say, oh, look, it's taught in the Targums. But if you systematically study the Targums, it doesn't say that at all. For instance, there's a instance in the Targums where it says that this human being's memra had a covenant with another human being's memra. Well, how do you make sense of that? Are there four people now involved? And so it's not so much like to look and say, well, the Targums say it, therefore it's definitively true, or authoritative. It's just taking into consideration all of the different elements of context, which are going to be most relevant, figuring out which ones are most relevant to our
food
author.
For thought.
Yeah.
Food for thought. Right.
And And so I don't know. So but in the Hebrew Bible, it clearly seems to be that, well, an angel of the Lord appeared. And it clearly seems to say that God himself ate food with Abraham. And so that's not something we can just dismiss, right? And say like, oh, the Targums say this, therefore let's just dismiss it. It's just, I think it goes back to, well, how do we understand the angel of the Lord?
Well, do you see where Paul, alludes to this fact that even men have entertained angels unawares? They've literally been talking to angels and they didn't even realize it. And that could not only be talking about Abraham in his encounter with the two angels and God himself, from my standpoint, that literally, Paul is saying, yes, you might have a stranger, you might be entertaining, welcoming a stranger, and you're not even aware who exactly that person is and who's standing in front of you. And God likes to test men's hearts to see what kind of reaction he'll get. Because if he appears in all of his glory, it's too easy. I mean, everybody will be like, oh yeah, I worship you. And we know when the boss is around, everyone is busy. But when he's out, like the mouses are dancing, and the expression. Do you see that? Like God can.
Yeah, he could. That's definitely something we have to keep on the table as a possibility. I think it would be foolish to dismiss that as a possibility, and irresponsible, I guess, is a better word. And there's
did Philo refer? Sorry, Andrew. Did Philo refer to the word as a demiurge Because you're more familiar with Philo's
So
demiurge.
So Philo has a ton of work. I'm definitely not an expert, and even the experts will kind of disagree a little bit.
Right.
So and there's no like systematic doctrine from Philo. He's more just somebody who's a man who is a philosopher, and he's thinking about these certain things. And so,
because if I'm not mistaken, Andrew, I know that Philo taught that the Word was literally an entity separate from God the Father, and I know you've presented the case where it's not. You don't see it at all in that way. I would be interested in some quotes, if possible, maybe next time, or if you've got, depending on the time you have. But I have seen the case made that Philo of Alexandria taught that the demiurge, the Word, was creating on behalf of the supreme God. And Albert Pike literally says this. He says that, in Philo of Alexandria's view, this was like a subservient, subordinate being to the supreme God. And he was like the architect, he was like the builder, and the supreme God was the architect. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that. I would be skeptical about anything Albert Pike says, like we've already talked about, like the mysteries. And it's the same thing with the Memra. I think a lot of people look back on the Memra and they'll say, well, the Memra is definitely a separate person from God. But if we systematically study what the Targums say, we'll come to the understanding that the Memra is not a distinct person from God. It's just speaking about the particular revelation. And so the same thing, Philo does say that that God is the cause. We have to understand the cause and the instrument. But when we see Philo talk about that God is the architect who made a blueprint is not a person.
Sure.
And when Philo says that the idea of ideas is the logos, an idea is not a person. It's more philosophical than it is like a pagan would see it as. And if the pagans believed it literally, which I think we kind of think they do when they think about Zeus and all these people, I would say that the evidence is against that, because Philo talks about the logos being a blueprint, and he also talks about the logos being the container of ideas. And he also talks about how before God created the sensible world that we see with our eyeballs, he created an intelligible model, which is the ideal world, which is what man is supposed to ascend and see beyond the physical to get into to see, which is an expression of the mind of God, an exact imprint of his nature.
Sure. Okay, that's it. That's interesting. I think we're going to come to a close, my dear Andrew. You're welcome to come anytime. And also, in private, if you want to talk about these things, you're more than welcome. So I just want to leave that invitation that you're welcome to come next time. If you would like to do a part 2 or a specific topic, I would be more than willing to engage with you again.
Yeah, this is better than I could have imagined. I feel like God really blessed this conversation.
Yes.
And I'm glad that we're right here talking about things that are actually going to be productive, rather than wasting our time with the ultimate distractor and his doctrines,
Right. I agree. Well, dear brothers and sisters, thank you for joining. And maybe, but did you still have time, like maybe for some questions? I had some questions here. So I don't know if you want to like quickly address some of these questions. Do you have like 2 minutes?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Whatever questions people have. Yeah.
And if you do, and if any of you in the chat, you do have like a specific question for Andrew or even for me, just feel free to send those questions. So I did see a couple of questions here in the beginning, and just bear with me. Okay, so one question here is, your spirit in you, does that make you two persons? So like the flesh and
Yeah,
the
well,
outer, right?
so some people see a human as a sort of a dichotomy of where there's a flesh body and a spirit. Me personally, I see that there's a body and a soul and a spirit. And so the spirit is what will continue to, I mean, the soul is what will continue to live on, but it's the spirit which essentially animates the body and also makes us receptive to um, God's spirit. And so that's how they sort of interact. It impresses upon the soul and the body. And so I think it was Miles Monroe who has a good video about that dynamic between body, soul, and spirit, and talks about how, like, the things that we do in our physical body affect the spirit realm. They affect our soul, and then it affects the spirit and the ability to be receptive to the Holy Spirit, which the Holy Spirit is going to in turn impress upon our soul and to our body. But short answer, no. The person to me is the soul, but it's also an interesting dynamic of consciousness. Are we a conscious being perceiving reality through our physical bodies, or are we physical bodies and that is a soul? This is something that comes up among Unitarians where I sort of just disagree, but we speculate, but according to the Bible. But I think that that's a sound. But ultimately, short answer, no. We're just one person.
Right. I do see. I do agree with you in that regard. I am. I could be like. I could see like the flesh and the spirit. You said what, a dichotomist? Is that the term you used?
Yeah, some people will see that. I would say trichotomist, just two or three different parts. Yeah.
Right. And in the regard of the flesh and spirit, I do see that dichotomy, but I do see a third aspect, but not as a separate third level of existence in the person, in the man. I do see it as a combination, like the spirit and the flesh is that combination that ultimately is the third, if that makes any sense. And I believe the Hebrews, they believed that the spirit and the flesh and the blood ultimately enabled the person to experience human existence. When that was severed, you no longer have that ability of experiencing life as a creature, if that makes any sense. There was another question quick here. How many bear record in heaven? 3 or 1?
Yeah, well, like you've already said, that's clearly an addition to the text, but the original text would be that it's the Father, the Word, and the Spirit anyways. So you have the Father, and it's His Word and His Spirit. And so it's sort of I agree with Caleb that it's sort of the Word and the Spirit are just manifestations of the one person, right? I mean, so
right. And there was just a last question here. 2 last questions. So Asterix says, it confirms that God is the Word and you cannot separate them, or is the Father mute? Would you like to address that?
What was the question again?
So it confirms that God is the Word and you cannot separate them, so hence God and His Word. Or is the Father mute, silent, meaning silent, as I was, the utterance, right?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's like, well, what do you mean the Word, and how is the Word separate? And people say this too about, for instance, in Proverbs 8, it talks about how God acquired wisdom before creating anything, and it's like, well, does that mean God was ignorant, that He needed to learn something? But it's a particular wisdom which relates to the created world, and it's more saying that God did things with intention, rather than saying that He was ignorant of something. and so God's word, essentially, when he says, like in Isaiah 55, I think, the word which comes out of my mouth will accomplish what I will it to do, and it will not return to me void.
Right.
So the actions are happening, which is because God decreed it to happen. And I think it's
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. This would be the last question. Thank you for your answer,
I'm
Andrew.
gonna turn my camera off for just 1 second. My wife's gonna come in.
No
She doesn't wanna
worries.
be on camera.
This is the last question. Better Than Gold is asking, Brother Sergio, do you believe the flesh and blood of Jesus is of the Word or from Mary? Well, I can answer that. I believe. Yeah, go ahead. No, please. Go
No.
ahead.
Yeah, no. I want to hear how you explain it.
Yes, I believe that the flesh and blood of Jesus was not pre-existent. I do believe that it came about in the incarnation. And I do believe that God used properties within Mary and even from her forefathers in that body.
Yes. Yeah. So it's interesting. Like, how do we explain it? And it's one of those things that we don't know exactly what happened, but we do have a certain amount of evidence. If we are to accept the virgin birth, and I don't really see a reason to deny it. What happened? Because clearly he didn't have the DNA of a biological father.
True.
But he might have had the DNA of a biological woman. But how did God create the sort of DNA of the man and to create this new human being? We don't really know. But I would say that in a lot of ways it is of the word and that God decreed it to happen and made it happen. And so it is probably from both.
I agree. And I would even say that would make the case that he is divine because it's miraculous. It stems directly from God. That I would just close with that. That would be my final comment. Anyway, so thank you again, Andrew. I really appreciate it, my friend. And yes, like I said, you're welcome here. You're a friend. You're welcome here anytime.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, brothers and sisters.